Police officers of Reddit, what's the oddest place you've encountered people you formally arrested? Story from a friend and co-worker back in my CO days. He was at a Mexican restaurant in Los Angeles with his wife and kids when a guy came up and asked him if he was Officer X. My friend anticipated the worst and pushed his son behind him as he turned to the guy. He told the guy yes and asked him why. The guy turned to his friends and said, "Yo, this is Officer X. He treated me really cool last time I was locked up. Definitely could have gone worse." A couple months prior we had a CO sent to the hospital after an encounter with a former detainee at a gas station. Wasn't long after that when I decided it wasn't worth the risk to my new family and I changed professions. How about meeting the officer who arrested you? I recently hit the 60-day mark for AA. A few years back, I was picked up for DUI and the cop took no crap. No excuses. Dropped me in holding. Next morning he showed up. Coffee, aspirin, and Powerade. Took the time to talk to me and gave me a card for a guy he knew. Well, last month, when I hit 30 days, the cop showed up. Turned out before becoming a cop, he had been a booze monkey, although he never got in legal trouble. My sponsor, the guy he knew, had been his sponsor. The officer was coming in to tell us his story of how he changed his life, and how we could too. Thing is, half of us there had met this cop, and been given the number for the local AA chapter, and he remembered each and every one of us. And yes, it took me 2 years to finally admit I had a problem. So glad that you were able to admit you had a problem and got help. Congrats on 60 days. I truly hope you are able to stay sober. This stranger in Canada is rooting for you. I'm not a cop, but years ago I got arrested for drunk in public. Not a proud moment. At the cop shop I was honest and told them I'd also done some blow. The arresting officer spent like an hour lecturing me about drug abuse and alcohol abuse and how destructive it is. He wasn't wrong. 2 years later I went to rehab because I got out of control. First group therapy session, and guess who is sitting in the circle? Bingo, the arresting cop from 2 years ago. We became good friends and still call each other from time to time. I'm glad you got yourself into recovery and that you have, I think, stayed clean. A police officer friend visited a restaurant with his family. They had at least a dozen people seated, dressed nicely. After a round of drinks, they placed their order with the waitress. Food took a long time to arrive, but just before the food was ready, a dishwasher came out of the kitchen and pulled my cop friend aside. He advised to the officer that the chef had recently received a DUI from this officer, and thought the chef was enthusiastically looking forward to the servers bringing out the food, so he can get revenge. Needless to say, the officer rounded up his party, paid for the drinks, and they quickly headed elsewhere. To this day, I wonder if the chef simply put his ballsack in the food, or if it was much more dangerous, like poison. We'll never know. I feel like it had to be pretty bad if his co-worker warned him. Boston Market. I arrested this guy after his wife came in and claimed he strangled her the night before. I live about 40 minutes away from the town I work for. About 3 weeks after the arrest, I walked into BM to get dinner for me and my wife. I turn around and the guy I arrested was a few people behind me in line. We made eye contact. We both knew our food was more important to both of us. He was getting food about 40 minutes from his house, so I guess him and his wife didn't get back together. This happened many years ago in my grandparents' small farming country town in Australia, which is why everyone knew about it and told all their relatives about it. It's that sort of place. One Sunday the policeman, the town is so small it only has one cop, abruptly got up and walked out of church in the middle of the service. His wife was annoyed at the rudeness. Then at the end of the service the policeman was hanging around the door as people walked out, until a man visiting his elderly parents appeared, upon which he grabbed his elbow and said, "Could I please have a word, sir?" It turned out this man was visiting his parents because he was wanted in the UK for fraud so big he was featured in the new issue of Interpol which had arrived that morning. The policeman had gone home to double check he wasn't recognizing the wrong guy before he arrested him. He was featured in the new issue of Interpol which had arrived that morning. This kind of makes it sound like a magazine. This month, the top 10 fashion crimes of 2017. When I was addicted to I used to get really paranoid out in public, and there was this one cop who would always drive me home, or calm me down. Never arrested me though, and he was always super nice even though I was always zonked out. I'm guessing it's because I was only ever a danger to myself. Anyway, I got sober and hadn't seen him in months. Went on vacation out of town and saw him and his family in vacation too. We caught up and he told me how much better I looked now that I was off the drugs. Beautiful. Congratulations. My dad was a cop for 30 years. 30 years after he arrested this guy as a beat cop, he was at a bar in Florida. This guy kept eyeing him up and down. My dad started talking to him. Found out they were from the same city in NY. That's when the guy was like, holy crap, your officer poop drunks dad. You locked me up 30 years ago. As you can imagine, you never know how it's gonna go from there. If the guy is gonna attack or something crazy like that. Ultimately the guy thanked him saying it's what finally got his life on track and bought him a beer. Officer poop drunk. I've been working my screenplay for years. It's perfect. The plot is fantastic and unique. The characters all build over flawless story arcs. And the depth is unmatched in any cop drama. All I needed was a name for the main character. I think I have arrived. My dad was in the gang squad for a bit. Arrested a guy fairly high up in one of the local motorcycle gangs. A few years later the whole family is at one of those restaurants where they cook in front of you and they seated the guy he arrested at our table. My dad and this guy give each other a tense greeting and we begin our meal. I turn to the guy, I was 4 years old, and say, hi, I'm you hippocampus too. My daddy is a policeman and he catches bad guys. What do you do? And he responds, I'm a bad guy and he caught me. My dad is just about in tears, he's laughing so hard. The guy ended up buying my parents a bottle of wine and lobster for the whole table. Love this story. No one can resist an innocent 4-year-old. I'm cop. Involuntarily committed a guy who was threatening suicide and found by the train tracks. He disputed my decision and brought us to a commitment hearing to get out. Was committed by the judge anyway based on my testimony. Gave me my birth control prescription at the pharmacy at CVS. Working at CVS made me really depressed, too. Not a police officer, but I'm a reporter who has worked with police officers and judges over the past several years. I was talking to a judge one time and he told me a story about how, years and years ago, he threw a guy in jail on some charge. I can't remember what it was. A few months after that, the judge was leaving our local municipal airport, and he looks up to see one of the guys loading bags onto the plane is none other than the guy he threw in jail. He said they got to talking and the guy wasn't mad at the judge at all. He said what he did was stupid and he didn't blame the judge for throwing him in jail. The judge told me he saw that guy several more times over the years and they became almost sort of friends. I also know of a local police officer who stopped getting food at Hardee's because one time when he was off duty he went there and recognized the guy making the food as someone he had once arrested. He said that was the last time he ever went there. Not a police officer, but my dad was. When I was around 6 or 7 we were renting a house in a suburb outside of the large city my dad worked for. We had a maintenance guy come out for some repairs to the house. I was following him around while he worked and was in the back of the house with him when my dad comes out of his bedroom. This guy turned white as a ghost and started stammering. My dad tells me to get out of here. There is yelling and a few punches thrown by my dad before he takes this guy down. Turns out he had arrested him a few weeks before and the guy saw the picture of us my dad kept with him and went into detail about how he was going to slit me and my siblings' throats while my dad watched. It was apparently purely coincidental, but my dad got a restraining order. We had a very aggressive patrol on our street for the next few weeks. Good times. Not a police officer, but a lawyer. I went to trial on a horrible DUI. 3x the legal limit. Found in his car, in the driver's seat, car on, in front of the liquor store. Somehow we won. The next week, I went to that same liquor store and my client was there. He was not supposed to be drinking but court orders. I'm a cop in Canada. Mountie. I arrested this dude for drunk driving. Zero tolerance for drunk driving as that crap kills people. The guy was super pleasant and cooperative. He's never gotten into trouble before. I'm guessing this was just a bad decision after a party. He was scared to spend the night in cells. After the paperwork was done I tried to phone his girlfriend as requested to pick him up and take him home. But she was too pissed off at him and let him spend the night in jail. I put myself in his shoes and I remember how scary a night in jail can be. I wasn't always law-abiding pre-career, so I checked on him a lot that night and even played cards with him in the cell when it got quiet. I took him outside for a smoke break too. Years later, I'm partying in Cabo and lo and behold this random arrest I made years prior was there partying too. 2 countries away. Our girlfriends got along great and we partied with this guy and his girlfriend for pretty much the whole vacation. He was good crap, that guy. As a Texan with very little experience with Canadians aside from a former employer and Canadians I've met in Mexico, this reaffirms the stereotype I have ingrained in my mind. Disclaimer: firefighter. In college, I did firearms in the town where I attended school. The number of times I ran into someone on a 20,000 person campus that I had recently taken to the hospital neared statistical impossibility. My favorite was standing behind a girl in line at the dining hall that I had taken in the ambulance the weekend prior. She had been severely drunk, on the floor in the common room of a dorm. Her friends had abandoned her there after she crap herself and was rolling in her vomit. Obviously, I couldn't say anything to her but she happened to look back at me and we made eye contact. She politely gave a half smile and looked away then whipped her head around in a double take. Her face was white. She slowly started to say, "Are you a firefighter?" So I quickly said yup. Won't say anything and noped out to the other side of the hall. That was not a conversation I wanted to have over dinner. Made eye contact at a local bar with a guy I had locked up on some bull's warrant the week previous. He walked straight towards me and I'm trying to act as calm and nonchalant as possible while planning out exactly how I'm gonna kick his butt when he starts a fight with me. He came over and asked if I knew who he was. I said yup. He said, "I just wanna thank you for not treating me like a piece of crap." And he bought me a beer after shaking my hand. Really caught me off guard. This happened about 7 years ago and I'll never forget it. Read a story once. Can't be sure if it's true though, about an Englishman that emigrated to New Zealand. He got pulled over for speeding by a cop that also had an English accent. After thinking for a minute he asks the cop if he was also a policeman in England before he moved abroad. The cop confirms he was, and the area he worked in back home. "So that's where I know you from. You gave me a speeding ticket once before, about 6 years ago, some 14,000 miles away." There's a historic prison in my city that's open for tourists. You can go on ghost tours and look in the cells of mass murderers and see where people tried to escape. So this prison is life 150 years old but only closed around 15 years ago. And apparently ex-inmates like to go on the tours and bring their families and stuff. One time they're running the Great Escapes tour telling the story of the guy who hid in the floorboards for 5 days. And one of the people on the tour pipes up like, "No, it was 6 days. Turns out he had been the escapee and took great delight in telling the other tourists all about it. My dad is a prosecutor and about 18 years ago, shortly before we moved, our pizza delivery guy was someone he had sent to prison. We also had the house across the street shot up more than once by guys he had been seeing in juvenile court for years. Needless to say, we don't live there anymore. Not really an encounter, but there's this TV show in Britain that's called Name of Area on Benefits. It's basically a reality show about people on benefits and are sadly extremely poor. It takes place where my mum worked when she was a police officer and oh my god, she has arrested pretty much everyone on that show. My Bill was a state trooper. He went out to a social function while off duty hosted by a fellow trooper, who proudly introduced his new date, who was a very attractive woman, who my Bill had also arrested for drugs, repeatedly. She was a frequent flyer for drug charges and had cases pending over her head. Fellow trooper had not known her very long and had no idea yet, but Bill was obligated to drop the dime quietly to fellow trooper. He wasn't unsympathetic, but department policy would have been problematic if fellow trooper associated with felons with pending charges off duty. He hated to have to do that to both of them. Early in my shift, I stopped a guy on a traffic stop that had a warrant. Took him to jail. Later in my shift I stopped another vehicle where the driver was DUI. Driver was one of the jail staff that took my guy earlier. Nice guy, but always tried staring me down anytime after that I was in the jail. DUI is DUI. Nobody gets a break for that. Heard this story from a guy who is an author now, but years ago, He was an undercover FBI agent. He had gotten in pretty deep into the mob, and years later, while shopping at Kmart, he runs into a guy who was in the gang he had infiltrated. He saw him from a distance and he knew he had to bolt. At this point the guy was out, but he knew he had to get the heck out of the store, so he went out, with his kid, through the back. Shopping in Kmart, a fate worse than death. City cop here. Work in the city I live. Took my dad to lunch and saw a dude I arrested about a week and a half prior for DV. He saw me and I saw him. He kind of just nodded and kept to himself. We were seated near each other, and I said, "We all good?" He kind of smiled and said, "Yeah, we good. You're not working, so I can't be afraid of you." Not a crazy story, but it's a story. I appreciate that you're the kind of cop that someone you arrested isn't afraid of you when you're off duty. You did your job, but you're not a villain. Story from a friend's dad. I'm not a cop. He had just bought a house and was throwing a friend, also a cop, a bachelor party. All of his friends were there, also cops. Things got very loud and I think 2 of them ended up in a fist fight in the front yard. Neighbors called the cops. 4 cops showed up. Small suburban town, nothing ever happening. That's why so many of the cops asked for summit once everything was calmed down. The look of disappointment when they started getting handed badge after badge was something he would never forget. Best part about it is the next day they all had to go to work with the cops that broke up their party. I grew up in a small town. Was arrested for DUI. Ran into the guy that arrested me all the time. Gas station, supermarket, act. If you ran into him all the time, no wonder you were arrested for DUI. Funnily enough, it was at Thanksgiving dinner, though it wasn't the arresting officer, it was my corrections officer, a little over 10 years ago while on probation. Just after getting off house arrest, I go to my then girlfriend's house for dinner, and he's sitting on the couch. Turns out he was her cousin. He had no clue I was dating his cousin, and I had to get a new CO due to conflict of interest. Not my story, but a friend of my mother's. This woman worked as a nurse, but became bored of it. She trained to be a police officer instead. She still moonlighted as a nurse in a for extra cash. One day she arrested a guy who needed to go to the hospital before jail. Just so happened it was the hospital she worked at. Dropped him off and went back to work. After she got off of work as a police officer she went to go nurse. And lo and behold who is her patient? But that guy she arrested and dropped off earlier in the day. Poor guy was probably so confused and freaked out. I'm not a police officer. 3 years or so ago I used to work at a festival bar. Everyone working at the bar had to wear the same costume. About 2 hours in my shift, the police showed up, looking for one of my colleagues. The guy they came for noticed, started running and the officers chased him. 10 minutes later, the guy was back to work. He'd just circled around, came back working. He figured they wouldn't be looking for him back at work. He was right. I work in a low-end roofing merchant and we have a handful of rough roofers who use cheap labor. Turns out one job they are doing recently on a house was owned by a policeman who had previously arrested 3 of the 5 laborers. Not a cop, but was arrested for stealing a computer from school with a friend. 17 and stupid. 10 years later my car gets stolen and the same guy turns up to do the investigation. After he made a joke about the shoe being on the other foot, we were chatting like old mates. He told me that my old friend whom I hadn't seen since school is a frequent flyer with the police force and didn't learn from the computer incident. 2 days ago I was in a local grocery store. I've been plain clothes for 12 plus years. I was on lunch break and wearing a jacket with our badge logo. Some guy, early 20s, walked past me. He turned around, did the full tongue out thumbs and ears waving fingers thing like a 5-year-old in a schoolyard. I'm assuming I probably put the habeas grabus on him at some point in my career, but I don't recall. Just a guess. This actually happened. I still have the WTF look on my face. Don't know about Oddest, but my cousin is an officer, and he once went through a drive-thru and someone he'd arrested was working it that day. My cousin smelled his drink and it smelled funny, so he sent it to the lab to be tested. It had cleaning chemicals in it. And then my brother was a hooligan in our town in high school. He would regularly attend parties that inevitably got busted TF up by the local PD. Well, he ended up marrying his high school sweetheart, who, incidentally, became an officer at the PD. Needless to say, the first time he met her co-workers was a mix of funny and uncomfortable. One of my favorite cop stories from working overnights at the coffee shop was when one of my regular officers came in looking beat and told me he'd been to see to a domestic call at a local trailer park and came out to find one of his regulars taking a dump on his windshield. Not a policeman. This just happened recently. I had been on felony probation for a few years, was released from probation back in 14 feet. I never had any type of encounters with any of them. About 4 weeks ago during work we pulled up to a local BK and I saw this car. A little Chevy. I have seen slot of these cars but I never paid any mind to them except this once. I tell my guys, hey look, it's my old POND. They're like, really? I said nah. I go inside to order my food and shot. It was my ducking old PO. We had a good talk. He's proud of me and what I have done. He left a good impact on my life and I personally thanked him. I'm not the Leo, but my neighbor is. We are standing in my driveway when a couple of guys pull up going door to door trying to sell AT&T service. My buddy turns his back to the guy and starts getting weird. I shoo them away. As soon as they are gone he tells me that he had just arrested one of the guys for DUI. Didn't want him knowing where he lived. Not a police officer but the reptile club I am a part of was doing a reptile safety presentation for children at a safety education event. One of the members from out of town had a serious drug problem in the past and one the police, also from out of town, doing a different presentation had arrested her multiple times for carrying M. He was shocked to see her there covered in snakes doing a children's event. Fortunately the interaction seemed to go well between them. I've been spending too much time on the internet. I read Reptile Club and immediately thought Illuminati. In the subway, whilst on my way home, I was pretty sure he wouldn't have recognized me anyway because I was only one of the 5 people that had arrested him before, and he got arrested a lot, but I wrapped my scarf around my head and got out at the next station regardless. Had one come to my house selling magazine subscriptions. I don't think he recognized me. Most people don't seem to recognize police out of uniform. I was freaked out for a while because I knew his history, it isn't good. I've also moved twice since, not because of him. Recently I had been working a rather large investigation with federal agencies. Had a GPS on the suspect's vehicle and were also tracking their phone. Don't worry, we had warrants. They were within about 6 blocks of my home. That one actually had me scared. They had been making threats against me. They are all in jail now and still directing threats towards me, but I think they were planning on hitting one of the banks near me. While on patrol in my town I saw old high school friend, went up, gave her a hug and started chatting with her. As I looked at the 2 people she was with, I realized I had arrested one of the guys for DUI just a couple months earlier. Talked to him briefly and it was fine. Super awkward though. Also, just saw a new employee of the diner a few of the patrolmen eat at every night. Just released from prison after 3 months for committing over 30 burglaries in our town. Junkie trying to support her habit. We're kind of used to it as it seems the prerequisite to working at that diner involves some sort of drug habit. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.